So the weight loss pill and also treatment for diabetes has some real medical impacts as well. Ozempic has caused a massive storm in terms of cultural acceptance and questions about potential side effects. So we're very fortunate to be joined by a 3-time New York Times bestselling author, Johann Hari, who has just written a new book delving into all the questions about, let's go ahead and put this up on the screen, what he is calling magic pill. And the subtitle here is The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. Johann Hari, great to have you. Welcome, sir.
I'm ridiculously happy to be with both of you. I'm such a fan of the show, so thank you so much.
You're too kind, far too kind.
You're way too kind, because you are a hero.
So first of all, let's just start with the question that is elicited by the title here. Is Ozempic and these other weight loss drugs, are they actually a magic pill?
There's sort of 3 ways these drugs could be magic. The first is they could just solve the problem of obesity. And I've got to tell you, there are days when it feels like that. I've been taking these drugs for a year. I've lost an enormous amount of weight and my health has got much better. And it feels a bit like, whoa, all my life I've been massively overeating processed food because I was screwed up by the food industry. And now I inject myself in the leg once a week and it's kind of gone away, right? There are days it feels like magic in that simple sense. The second way it could be magic is much more disturbing. It could be a magic trick. It could be like the conjurer who shows you a card trick while secretly picking your pocket, right? It could be that in addition to giving you these benefits, it steals from you, it causes such big risks that they outweigh the benefits. That is a real possibility. I go through 12 big risks of these drugs in the book. But I actually think the third way they could be magic is the most likely. Think about like the stories of magic we grew up with as kids, like Aladdin, right? You find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, and you get your wish granted, and it comes true, but never quite in the way that you expected, right? And we're already seeing these drugs are playing out, having societal effects for good and for bad that are way beyond what we would have anticipated at the start. And this is just the beginning, because 47% of Americans want to take these drugs.
Right, you had a really interesting interview you gave to GQ where you said this could be the next opioid crisis. What did you mean by that, Johann?
So there's a lot of benefits to these drugs, but there are a lot of risks. And you've gone to the one that I am most worried about for the society. The thing that most alarms me is what will happen when young girls, it is overwhelmingly girls, with eating disorders get hold of these drugs, which has already begun, and eating disorders experts who I interviewed are warning about it. So anyone who knows people with eating disorders knows they're in a conflict. There's the part of them that psychologically, for complicated reasons, wants to starve themselves. And then there's the part of them that biologically wants to live and therefore eat. And what these drugs do, whoever you are, is it massively empowers the part of you that doesn't want to eat, right? I mean, it's like shutters come down on your appetite. I can't describe to you how strange it is. My appetite was dialed down by 80%, and I'm not on the highest dose of the drug, right? Now, for someone like me who was obese, I'm older than my grandfather ever got to be because he died of a heart attack when he was 44. As we know, sadly, the heart attack risk is massively increased by obesity. For someone like me, that's bringing me down to a healthy zone. But for many people who are taking the drugs who are already skinny or a healthy weight, is taking them into the danger zone. So I'm very worried that there's going to be a large number, in fact, I believe this has already begun, a large number of young girls who take these drugs and starve themselves to death in a way they would not have been able to otherwise. That's why we need to urgently change the rules. Stop letting people get these drugs on Zoom. That is crazy. You should have to go and see a doctor who can check your BMI, check your weight, and crucially is trained to detect eating disorders.
I think part of why there's been some discomfort with Ozempic and other similar drugs is, number one, the questions about, allowing children to have these drugs. On the one hand, you have this massive, especially in the US, epidemic of childhood obesity that nothing seems to be really working to combat, at least nothing that we've actually tried. On the other hand, we don't know the long-term consequences and risks of this drug. And then the other piece that I'd like you to weigh in on is, listen, we all know the way that the, factory food system in the US is screwed up, and how the cheapest and easiest things to eat are, ultra processed crap. We have these sedentary lifestyles. And so there's also to be said about, are we now just creating massive profits for the pharmaceutical industry by, rather than dealing with any of those underlying root cause issues, just giving people a quote unquote magic pill? So what are your thoughts on those two pieces?
Yeah, I think this is the deepest question. And I think actually the answer to them is kind of the same. And this is of all the kind of issues I wrestled with as I was working on the book, this was, to me, one of the most important. So obesity has exploded in our lifetimes. We're a similar kind of age. I think you're both a little bit younger than me, but between the year I was born, 1979, and the year I turned 21, obesity more than doubled in the United States. If you want to see something weird, just look at a photo of a beach in 1979, anywhere in the US or indeed the Western world. It seems really weird to us. Everyone is what we think of as skinny or jacked, right? You're like, where was everyone else on the beach that day? Then you look at the figures, that is what people look like in 1979, not a million years ago. You have 300,000 years where obesity is exceptionally rare, and now it's 42% of the population. What happened? That change happens everywhere that makes one change, and it's not where people become lazy or lack willpower or all the other stigmatizing things we say. It's very simple. It's where people move from eating a diet that is mostly fresh whole foods that are prepared on the day to eating a diet that is mostly processed and ultra-processed foods which are assembled out of chemicals in factories. And it turns out this new kind of food that never existed before affects us in a completely different way. And there's an experiment that really nailed this for me. Very simple experiment. I've nicknamed it Cheesecake Park. It was done by a scientist called Paul Kenny here in New York. He's the head of neuroscience at Mount Sinai. So basically, very simple. You get a load of rats and you raise them in a cage. And all they've got to eat is kind of healthy, nutritious food, the stuff that rats evolved to eat over thousands of years. And when that's all they've got, the rats will eat when they're full and just stop. They just naturally know to stop, and they never become overweight or obese. Then Professor Kenny introduced them to the American diet. He fried up some bacon, he got a load of Snickers bars. Crucially, he got a load of cheesecake and gave it to them alongside the healthy food. And the rats went crazy for the American diet. They would literally dive into the cheesecake and eat their way out and just emerge completely slick with it. And this natural nutritional wisdom that they used to have completely disappeared. They all became overweight or obese very quickly, actually became quite sick. Then Professor Kenny tweaked the experiment again in a way that feels a little bit cruel to me. As a former junk food addict, he took away all that food and left them with nothing but the healthy food again. And he thought he knew what would happen, that they would eat more of the healthy food than they had in the past. And that would mean, that would prove that this food expands the number of calories you eat, right? That is not what happened. What happened was much weirder. Once they'd had the American diet and it was taken away, they refused to eat any healthy food. It was like they no longer recognized it as food at all. It was only when they were literally starving that they finally went back to it. Now, this has happened to all of us. We all live in Cheesecake Park now, right? It's being done to our kids right now. It happened to me from when I was born. And when you see it like that, you begin to realize this food, this bizarre new kind of food, steals our satiety, our ability to ever feel full. And what these drugs do is they give us back our satiety, but with a whole set of accompanying risks. This is why Professor Michael Lowe said to me, they're an artificial solution to an artificial problem, right? So I think you're absolutely right in, Krystal, in the way you framed that.
So, Johann, this is the ultimate question. What about for children? So there was a lot of controversy here in the US where I believe it was a government-endorsed panel actually said that they would recommend giving some of these GLP-1 agents to children who were clinically morbidly obese. So not just obese, but morbidly obese. Given your experience now also, I'd like to hear on, what do you think about both giving this to people with developing systems, going through puberty and all of that, and also the likelihood that they may need to stay on such a drug forever? Would love to hear you reflect on that.
The really agonizing thing here, this is true for adults, but it's even, it's 10 times more for children, is you have to weigh two sets of risks when it comes to these drugs. You've got to weigh the risks of ongoing obesity, which are shocking. I mean, I was taken aback by the science about how bad it is. Obesity increases over 200 known complications and diseases. You've got to weigh that risk alongside the risks of the drugs, many of which are unknown. And that's an extremely hard calculation to do. I would recommend anyone kind of go through. In the book, I go through what we know about the risks of obesity and what we know about the 12 big risks of these drugs, and just figure out as best we can which of these apply to you. Now, that's an agonizing enough decision for someone like me, but if I'm making that decision for a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, the first thing to say about that is it is crazy as a society we have allowed ourselves to get to this point. Japan has almost no childhood obesity. I went there to see why. It's because they have policies to make sure their children are not poisoned and screwed up by the processed food industry. The first and most obvious thing is we should do that immediately so our kids don't face this choice. But I do really empathize with, for example, I interviewed a wonderful woman, a nurse in Connecticut called Deborah Tyler, whose daughter was 8 years old and having liver problems because she was severely obese. And she was facing an agonizing choice. And she chose to give her daughter Ozempic, and her daughter's health did significantly improve. But Deborah is extremely worried about the unknown long-term risks. I've really empathized with Deborah. We should never have been put in that position, given that we are. There are risks on both sides. I mean, if you're obese when you're 18, you have a 70% chance of developing diabetes in your life, and diabetes knocks 15 years off your life on average. Yep. These are, and that's just one of the effects. There are devastating effects of obesity, but there are very worrying effects about the drugs. There's concerns that it increases thyroid cancer, which are contested, but certainly plausible based on the French scientists I interviewed. Concerns about pregnant women. We know that anyone who's pregnant, we know that rats who get pregnant when they're taking these drugs are much more likely to have children with birth deformities. And there's just the risk of the unknown, right? What does it mean to take these drugs? That girl who's 8 years old, she's going to be taking it because these drugs stop working. You know, if you stop taking the drugs, the effect goes away and you become obese again. We're talking about her taking these drugs for 80 years, right? Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right also to allude to, you know, as Professor Dan Cooper at UC Irvine said, you know, children are not miniature adults, right? They need calories for bone mineralization, for all sorts of things. So these are really difficult decisions. And anyone who's telling you, I share your visceral disgust, but I think the disgust should be at the situation we've put children and their parents in. And then you've got to really just, anyone who's just rah, they're great, or boo, they're the devil, I think is missing the much more complicated and truthful picture, which is we're in a trap. This is the one risky, rusty trapdoor people are being offered. We need to dismantle the trap for sure. When you're in the trap, you've got to weigh the best evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's why we support you, man.
Johann, last question for you is, you have personally decided that the benefits outweigh the risks for you personally. Talk about what that balance looked like. What were some of the downsides from your perspective? And then if you could generalize more broadly for adults, how they should be thinking about whether or not this might be a right solution for them.
Yeah, for me, you know, if you take these drugs and you start with a BMI higher than 27, your risk of a heart attack or stroke goes down by 20%. And so many of the men in my family have heart attacks. And I tried dieting. My God, no one tried dieting more than me. And I kept getting fatter and fatter because after each of them. So for me, that benefit outweighs the risks. But I don't have a high degree of confidence about that, right? And someone could dig up this clip 30 years from now on YouTube when we know that some of the risks I warn about may turn out to be much bigger than we think and say, well, what a fool he was. For me, actually, weirdly, the hardest thing, I think there's a lot of things that I go through in the book that people who are thinking of taking these drugs need to know to prepare themselves. And one of them is, when you take these drugs, they radically interrupt your eating patterns. And one of the things that does or can do is bring to the surface the deep underlying psychological drivers of your eating all along. So for me, I realized how much I used food to calm myself down, soothe my emotions. And you just can't comfort eat when you're on these drugs. You would throw up if you tried to overeat. I remember going to brunch at KFC, had a bad day, bucket of chicken in front of me and thinking, oh, I can't eat this. I'm just going to have to feel bad, right? And now that can be a good thing. Bringing those emotions to the surface can mean you deal with them. But that's a bumpy transition. I think it's why a significant minority of people taking these drugs are becoming depressed. There even seem to be some risks around suicidal impulse, although that's contested. So for me, that was the hardest. But I think because this is such a it's hard to think of something more complicated than our relationship with food and food's relationship to our health. I think we've really got to think through all the dimensions of it. This is about to transform how we live. You know, Barclays Bank commissioned an analyst to look into the drugs. She said the best comparison for what this is going to do to our society is the invention of the smartphone. I think she's right. I think 10 years from now, half of Americans will be taking this. I hope we can take a beat to think through the positive and negative ways this is going to affect us and people can make the best informed decision for themselves and get angry about why we were ever put in this situation and fix the underlying causes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's well said. I think you've done a really well-considered job of looking at this. We respect a lot of your previous work, and so thank you for joining us, man. I think a lot of people will benefit from this.
What a joy.
Always a pleasure to get to chat with you, Johann. Congrats on the new book.
Cheers.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.